Elena stood at the center of the great hall in New Haven, surrounded by faces both familiar and strange. The humans sat on one side, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. On the other side sat the elves, or at least those few who had agreed to come to this gathering. Margaret stood near Elena, her arms crossed, waiting for the elf woman to speak. The dragons waited outside the hall, too large to fit through the doors. Elena could feel their presence through a bond she did not fully understand yet, a connection that seemed to run deeper than simple companionship. She took a breath and began to tell them everything she had learned in the Forbidden Zone. She spoke of the machine and its message. She spoke of the ancient builders who had created this world as a sanctuary. She explained how humans had been sent here as part of a plan, how elves had always belonged here, and how dragons were far more than just animals that could be tamed and ridden. The room remained silent as she talked, but she could see the skepticism in the eyes of both species. An old human man named Victor stood up and shook his head. He had been on this planet for 40 years and had never trusted the elves fully. "This is a fairy tale," he said harshly. "Ancient builders, ancient plans. How do we know you are telling the truth, Elena? How do we know the machine told you anything real? For all we know, you and those dragons of yours could be leading us into some kind of trap." Elena did not argue with him. She had expected this kind of resistance. Instead, she turned to Margaret. "Take me to the communication records. Show them what happened. The tower failed 3 months ago, correct? And tonight it came back online. The energy surge was detected by your satellites. A machine cannot lie about restoring technology." Margaret nodded slowly and had a young technician named David bring up the records on the large display screen. The data showed exactly what Elena had described. The tower had gone completely dark 3 months ago. Tonight, an enormous energy surge had occurred, and the tower had reactivated at full capacity. The satellite data even showed the glowing patterns spreading through the desert, where the ancient crystals lay beneath the sand. An elf woman named Lyra stood up from the other side of the room. She was older than Elena, with deep lines marking her ancient face. Lyra had lived through many generations of humans coming to this world, and she was naturally suspicious of their intentions. "Even if the machine's words are true, why should we believe that humans can be trusted to work alongside us? They came to this world taking what they wanted, building without asking permission." Elena looked at Lyra with respect. The elder elf spoke truth, but it was a truth that belonged to the past. Because if we do not work together, the threat that comes will destroy us all. The machine said a danger approaches from beyond the stars, something that the ancient builders anticipated. Would the ancient builders have put humans and elves on the same world if they did not intend for us to survive together? The hall filled with murmurs and quiet arguments. People were not ready to accept what Elena was telling them, and she understood why. Trust between species did not come easily, and asking them to believe in ancient machines and cosmic threats was asking them to abandon everything they thought they knew about their world. It was then that Ember appeared at the entrance to the great hall. The great purple and gold dragon had bent down as low as she could, pushing her massive head through the doorway. Storm followed, his midnight blue scales seeming to shimmer in the artificial light of the hall. Both dragons made soft humming sounds, and Elena realized they were trying to reassure the people in the room. Victor stood up again, fear clear on his face now. "The creatures should not be inside the colony," he said loudly. "This is dangerous." But before anyone could move to force the dragons back outside, something extraordinary happened. Ember's eyes began to glow with the same soft blue light that Elena had seen in the Forbidden Zone. The dragon released a wave of warmth that spread throughout the entire hall. It was not painful or threatening. Instead, it felt like being wrapped in the embrace of someone you trusted completely. One by one, people in the hall stopped arguing. The warmth from Ember seemed to touch something deep within them, some part of their mind that recognized truth. When the light faded from Ember's eyes, the entire room had changed. People looked at each other with new understanding. The fear had not disappeared entirely, but it had been joined by something else. Belief. Lyra was the first to speak. "I have lived for 300 years, the ancient elf said slowly. I have never felt anything like that warmth. It was familiar somehow. It was like touching something ancient and true. She turned to Elena. What the dragons did, it was not deception. No creature capable of producing such warmth would need to lie to us. Margaret walked forward and placed her hand on Ember's snout. The dragon did not pull back. Instead, the great creature made a soft sound that almost resembled a purr. If we work together, Margaret said, speaking to the room but keeping her own eyes on Ember, what are we capable of? If humans and elves can combine our knowledge and strength with the power of these dragons, what could we accomplish? Over the next several hours, the debate in the Great Hall shifted from whether Elena was telling the truth to how they should prepare for what was coming. Victor still had questions, and Lyra had concerns about how resources would be shared between humans and elves. But these were practical concerns about survival, not rejections of the fundamental truth that Elena had brought to them. By the time the night was half over, Elena had made a proposal that both Margaret and Lyra agreed to support. They would form a council made up of both humans and elves. This council would work together to prepare New Haven for whatever threat was approaching. They would share technology, share knowledge, and build defenses that took advantage of the strengths of both species. Elena also explained that the dragons were not simply animals to be controlled. Storm and Ember had intelligence and wisdom to share. They would be treated as allies and partners, not as servants or tools. When she said this, many people in the hall looked shocked. But Ember released another wave of warmth, softer this time, and people seemed to understand that Elena was speaking truth. As the great hall began to empty in the early hours of the morning, people heading back to their homes to sleep and process everything they had learned, Margaret approached Elena with a slight smile on her face. You did what I could not do in 20 years, the human leader said. You brought them together. For tonight, at least, humans and elves believe they can work as one. Elena watched Ember and Storm as they moved back outside the hall to find places to rest in the open areas beyond the colony walls. She could feel their contentment through the bond they shared. The dragons had shown the people of New Haven what true peace felt like, and that experience had opened their hearts to possibility. But Elena knew that warmth and good feelings would not be enough if the threat truly came. In the days ahead, they would need to prepare in practical ways. They would need to understand what was coming, where it was coming from, and how to defend against it. The machine had given them 3 cycles to get ready. Elena was not entirely sure how long a cycle was, but she suspected it was not much time at all. As dawn broke over the colony, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Elena stood on a high platform overlooking New Haven. She could see humans and elves already beginning to interact with each other in ways they never had before. Some were sharing meals. Others were discussing how to combine their building techniques. It was a small beginning, but it was a beginning. Storm approached her on the platform, his smaller size making it easier for him to fit into the tight space. The dragon rested his head against Elena's shoulder, and she felt the warmth of his scales through her clothing. She wondered what Storm and Ember understood about the threat that was coming. She wondered if they knew something about their own origins that she had not yet discovered. In the days that followed, Elena would begin her real work, not convincing people that they could trust each other, but teaching them how to stand together against an enemy they did not yet fully understand. The dragons would be her allies in this task, and somewhere in the distant reaches of space, something was moving toward their world with purposes and intentions that remained hidden in shadow. But for now, in this moment of dawn and new beginnings, Elena allowed herself to feel hope. She had taken the first step toward uniting her world. Everything that came next would be built on this foundation of trust and cooperation that she had helped create through the night. The newly formed council met in a repurposed warehouse that had been converted into a command center. Maps covered the walls, showing the geography of the continent and the strategic locations around New Haven. Elena stood before these maps with David, the young human technician, and an elf scientist named Kai. They had been working together for 5 days now, and the progress had been remarkable. Kai had spent most of his life studying the ancient ruins scattered across the planet. He had always believed that there was something more to discover in those ruins, some knowledge that the elves and humans had overlooked. Now, with access to human technology and Elena's connection to the machine in the Forbidden Zone, Kai had begun to unlock secrets that had been hidden for millennia. David pointed to several locations on the map. "We have found 3 more of these crystal formations," he explained, indicating spots that were spread across different continents. "If we can access all of them, we might be able to create a planetary defense network. It would be like the communication tower, but on a much larger scale." Elena listened carefully while Storm rested in a corner of the warehouse, his large frame taking up considerable space. The dragon had become a regular presence in the council meetings. Elena had come to understand that Storm and Ember were far more than simple beasts. They seemed to understand human and elf speech, and they could communicate through feelings and emotions that they shared with Elena. Kai spread out a stack of ancient texts and sculptures. "I have been translating records from the oldest elf libraries. My people kept these secrets very carefully, hoping that one day the knowledge would be useful. The ancient builders did not just leave us crystal technology. They left us warnings about what might try to reach this world." "What kind of warnings?" Margaret asked, leaning forward with interest. Kai's expression grew grave. "According to the texts, there are beings beyond our world who have a hunger for resources and territory. They are not invaders in the way humans understand invasion. They are more like a plague. Where they go, they consume everything, leaving behind only empty and barren worlds. The ancient builders discovered this threat when they were still traveling between stars. They decided to create sanctuaries, worlds hidden away and protected, where intelligent species could develop and eventually prepare their own defenses." Victor, who had become part of the council despite his initial skepticism, spoke up. "So we are one of these sanctuary worlds? And this plague is coming to our doorstep?" "It seems so," Elena said quietly. She could feel concern radiating from Storm, and she knew the dragon was processing the same troubling information. Over the next several days, the council worked frantically to access the other crystal formations. Expeditions were sent out from New Haven, made up of both humans and elves working together in teams. Elena and the dragons accompanied each expedition, using their abilities to navigate dangerous terrain and protect the explorers. The first new crystal site was found deep in the northern mountain range. When David and a team of elf climbers reached the location, they found the same kind of glowing crystals beneath the earth that Elena had discovered in the Forbidden Zone. When they activated them using the sequence that Elena had learned from the machine, the entire mountainside illuminated. From New Haven, hundreds of miles away, they could see the light reflected in the sky. The second crystal formation was located on an island far to the east. This was a more challenging journey, and Elena decided to fly there with both Ember and Storm, carrying a small team of explorers. When they arrived at the island, they found the crystals buried under sand on a beach that had not been disturbed for thousands of years. These crystals were different from the others, more refined somehow, and when activated, they seemed to be a part of a larger system. Elena realized that all the crystal sites were connected, not physically, but through some kind of energy network that spanned the entire planet. As the third site was being located, Elena spent more time communicating with the machine through the crystal network. She had learned how to send her thoughts and images through the crystals, and the machine responded with information and guidance. It told her about the history of the ancient builders, about the many worlds they had created, and about the nature of the threat that was approaching. The plague was called the Devourer by the ancient records. It was not a single creature or a single civilization, but rather a force that had evolved over millions of years. It consumed matter and energy, leaving behind only emptiness. Entire civilizations had fallen before it. Entire star systems had been sterilized by its passage. The ancient builders had created weapons, defenses, and technologies to resist it, but they had realized that they could not protect everything. Instead, they had chosen to create sanctuary worlds and leave guardians and knowledge behind. "We are running out of time," Elena announced at a council meeting 5 days before the deadline the machine had given them. "The machine has sent me calculations. The Devourer is approaching faster than the ancient builders anticipated. We have perhaps 3 days, not the 3 full cycles they mentioned." Lyra stood up immediately. "Then we must accelerate our preparations." "How many dragons do we have access to?" The records speak of great battles fought by the dragon kind in ancient times. Perhaps they remember how to fight. Elena shook her head slowly. Ember and Storm are the only dragons we have found. The machine indicated that there were once thousands of dragons across this world, but most of them were lost thousands of years ago. Somehow Ember and Storm are descendants of the originals, but they are the last of their kind. The news fell heavily on the room. 2 dragons against a cosmic force that had destroyed civilization seemed impossible, but Margaret stood up with determination on her face. Then we will train soldiers. We will prepare weapons. We will learn to fight as one unified force. Humans, elves, and dragons together. It will have to be enough. Over the next 2 days, the people of New Haven worked with an intensity and focus that exceeded anything they had accomplished before. The crystal network was fully activated, creating a protective energy field around the colony and the surrounding territory. Defensive positions were established on high ground. Humans and elves trained together, learning to fight as coordinated units instead of separate species. Elena spent time with both Ember and Storm, trying to understand the depths of their power and intelligence. She discovered that when the dragons worked together and focused their energy, they could project beams of concentrated light and heat that could destroy almost anything. They could also create barriers of pure energy that could protect people in areas beneath them. The dragons grew stronger as Elena learned to work with them, and she began to suspect that their power was somehow connected to her own mind and spirit. On the night before the deadline, the entire colony gathered at the highest point in New Haven. Elena stood with Ember and Storm looking up at the night sky. Lyra and Margaret stood on either side of her, with hundreds of humans and elves behind them. Victor was there too, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by a quiet resolve. "Whatever comes tomorrow," Elena said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "we will meet it as one people. The ancient builders created this world for us to survive and to thrive together. We have spent millennia learning to trust one another, and that trust is our greatest strength. The Devourer is mighty, but it has never faced a world where humans and elves fight as brothers and sisters. It has never faced dragons that are bonded to people who love them. It has never faced the unified will of an entire world that refuses to be consumed." Ember released a low rumble that seemed to shake the earth beneath their feet. Storm made a sound that was almost like singing, and from the people gathered around Elena, a cheer rose up that seemed to echo across the entire continent. It was a cry of unity, of determination, and of hope against impossible odds. The next morning, as the sun rose, the sensors detected movement at the edge of the star system. Something massive was approaching, something that blocked out the light of distant stars as it moved. The Devourer was coming, and the people of New Haven were ready to face it. The darkness came first. It was not the natural darkness of night or shadow, but an absolute absence of light that seemed wrong to the eyes. Elena stood on the defensive platform with Ember beside her, watching as something vast and incomprehensible entered the planet's atmosphere. The Devourer was not a ship or a creature in any traditional sense. It was a massive cloud of writhing energy and matter, with tendrils that extended for miles in every direction. Where it moved, the sky itself seemed to warp and distort. All across New Haven, sirens wailed to signal that the attack had begun. Thousands of soldiers, trained and ready, took their positions at defensive stations. The crystal network blazed with protective energy, creating a barrier of light that surrounded the colony and its surrounding territories. For a moment, the Devourer seemed to pause as if confused by this resistance. Then it attacked. The tendrils of dark energy lashed out at the protective barrier, trying to tear through it. The barrier held, but Elena could feel the strain on the system. The crystals beneath the ground were working at maximum capacity, channeling all their power into maintaining the defense. "Elena, we need you now." Margaret's voice crackled through the communication system that David had set up. "Coordinate with the dragons. We cannot hold for much longer." Elena turned to Ember and reached out to touch the great dragon's snout. Instantly, a flood of images and emotions rushed through her mind. She understood what Ember needed to do. The dragon released a blast of pure energy from her mouth, a beam of concentrated heat and light that cut through one of the Devourer's tendrils. The tendril shrieked, a sound that was unlike anything Elena had ever heard, and withdrew from the barrier. Storm appeared beside Ember, and the 2 dragons began to work in perfect coordination. Where one dragon's attack would wound the Devourer, The other would follow with a more powerful blast. The creature began to circle, changing tactics. It started to move lower in the atmosphere, trying to find a weakness in the protective barrier where it curved near the ground. Elena realized what the devourer was attempting. It was going to try to crush the barrier from the sides, focusing its strength on the weakest points of the defense network. She needed to access the other crystal sites and direct their power to the points of greatest strain. "Keep it occupied," Elena commanded to both dragons. Then she ran to the nearest aircraft, a small human transport that David had prepared for this exact purpose. She pulled the controls and lifted the aircraft from the ground, heading toward the nearest crystal site in the mountains. As she flew, she could see the devourer's tendrils attacking the barrier from multiple directions. The protective field flickered and dimmed in places where the assault was strongest. Elena pushed the aircraft faster, knowing that if the barrier fell completely, everyone in New Haven would perish. The devourer did not just destroy, it consumed, pulling everything into itself and breaking it down on a molecular level. She reached the mountain crystal site and raced out of the aircraft before it had fully landed. Her hands moved across the crystal interface, using the knowledge that the machine had shared with her through the network. She poured her mind and spirit into the crystals, asking them to send their power to support the barrier at its weakest points. The crystals responded. A beam of pure white light shot up from the mountain, extending upward through the atmosphere. Elena watched as the beam curved and bent, traveling across the sky toward the main colony. When it connected with the barrier, the defensive field blazed with renewed strength, but the devourer was adapting. Elena realized that it was learning from each attack, adjusting its tactics and becoming more effective. It was not mindless, not purely instinctual. This was an intelligent force, something that had evolved the ability to strategize and survive against the best defenses that civilizations could create. Elena got back into the aircraft and flew toward the island crystal site. She needed to get there and activate those crystals as well, to add their power to the defense network. Behind her, she could see the dragons continuing their assault on the devourer. Ember and Storm were bleeding energy, their attacks becoming more desperate and less coordinated. They could not keep this up forever. The flight to the island took only minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When Elena arrived, she could barely see the crystal formations through the growing darkness that the devourer was spreading across the entire continent. She ran to the beach and placed her hands on the crystals, repeating the same process she had used in the mountains. The island crystals responded, but more powerfully than the others. Elena realized that these were the primary crystals, the ones that connected to all the others. As she channeled energy through them, she felt a surge of power that seemed to come from deep within the planet itself. The barrier flared with blinding white light, and for a moment the darkness of the devourer was completely driven back. Elena felt something shift in the crystal network. New connections opened up, new sources of power that she had not realized were there. The ancient builders had left more than 3 crystal sites. There were thousands of them spread across the entire world, all dormant and waiting. Elena's consciousness reached out through the network, touching each one, asking it to awaken and join the defense. The effect was immediate and stunning. A web of light began to form across the entire planet's surface, a network of glowing lines that connected every crystal site to every other. The barrier around New Haven intensified 100-fold. The devourer's tendrils that touched the barrier now burned away like smoke. The creature gave another shriek, this one filled with something that sounded like pain and shock. Elena climbed back into the aircraft with newfound energy. The ancient builders had been thorough in their preparations. They had understood the devourer's nature and had created defenses that did not just rely on a handful of warriors and crystals, but on the entire planet itself. All of that power had been waiting for someone like Elena to unlock it. Someone who could bridge the gap between human technology, elf knowledge, and dragon ability. As she flew back toward New Haven, Elena could see the devourer beginning to retreat. The creature was moving higher into the atmosphere, pulling its tendrils back and consolidating its mass. It seemed to realize that direct assault would not work against this unified defense. The dark cloud that made up the devourer began to change shape, contracting into a more compact and dangerous form. Elena understood then that this was just the beginning. The devourer had not retreated because it was defeated. It had retreated because it was preparing for a different kind of attack. She reached out through the crystal network to contact the machine in the Forbidden Zone. "The devourer is adapting," Elena said through the network. What should we do? The machine's response came swiftly. You have done well, Elena. You have awakened the planetary defense system and proven that humans, elves, and dragons can work as one. But the Devourer will not leave. It will try a different strategy. It will send agents, infiltrators, things that are part of itself but appear as individual beings. Your defenses must now focus on protecting the crystal sites and keeping the network intact. If the Devourer can corrupt or destroy even one major crystal nexus, the entire barrier will fail. Elena felt a chill run through her body. They had survived the first assault, but the real war was only just beginning. The people of New Haven had shown incredible unity and strength, but they would need to remain vigilant and prepared for threats that were far more subtle than a direct attack. She landed the aircraft and went immediately to find Margaret and Lyra. They needed to organize search teams to guard the crystal sites. They needed to station soldiers at every location that the Devourer might try to target, and they needed to be ready for an enemy that could appear in forms they might not immediately recognize. For the first time since the crisis began, Elena wondered if even the combined strength of humans, elves, and dragons would be enough to survive what was coming next. 3 days had passed since the Devourer's first attack, and the colony had not rested since. Guards were stationed at all the crystal sites that had been discovered. Patrols moved constantly through the territory, searching for any sign of the infiltrators that the machine had warned about. Elena moved between locations, checking on defenses and working with both humans and elves to maintain the protective barrier. But something was wrong, and Elena could feel it. It was a subtle wrongness, like a note out of tune in a perfect symphony. Storm felt it too. The dragon had become increasingly agitated over the past day, making sounds of distress that Elena could feel through their bond. The first confirmation came from David, who approached Elena at the main command center with his face pale and worried. We have a problem, he said without preamble. One of the soldiers at the Eastern Crystal Site is not responding to communication. When we sent a team to investigate, they found him unconscious in one of the underground chambers. Elena's blood ran cold. What happened to him? We do not know yet, but the crystal output has decreased by 3%. It is subtle, but it is definitely happening. It is like something is slowly draining power from the network. Lyra was present as well, and she immediately understood the implications. The infiltrators have begun their work. They are not attacking directly. They are trying to weaken the barrier from the inside, slowly and carefully so that we will not notice until it is too late. Elena stood up. I need to go to that site immediately. Show me everything. The flight to the Eastern Crystal Site took only 30 minutes, with Ember carrying Elena swiftly across the landscape. The barrier still glowed around them, but now that Elena knew what to look for, she could see the faint irregularity that David had described. The power flow was indeed disrupted, diverted away from the main network into some kind of hidden channel. When she arrived at the crystal chamber, she found David and a team of elf scientists already working to understand what had happened to the soldier. The man's name was Robert, and he was still unconscious but alive. Elena placed her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady but slow. Look at this, one of the elf scientists said, pointing to the soldier's skin. There were marks on his arm, thin lines of luminescent material that seemed to be connected to his bloodstream. Elena immediately recognized them as part of the Devourer, infiltrators that had entered his body and were slowly taking over. We need to isolate him, Elena said urgently, and we need to find out if there are others who have been infected. These infiltrators could be anywhere and anyone. The realization sent shockwaves through the command hierarchy. If the infiltrators could possess people, could control them or drain them from the inside, then nobody could be trusted. Paranoia began to set in, and Elena realized that this was exactly what the Devourer wanted. It did not need to break the barrier through force. It could break it by turning the people inside the barrier against each other. Elena worked quickly with Lyra and the elf scientists to develop a test that could identify the infiltrators. It was a simple process, checking the bloodstream for the luminescent markers. Within hours, they had scanned hundreds of people and identified 8 individuals who showed signs of infection. But a troubling pattern emerged. The infected people were not randomly scattered. They held specific positions of importance. One was an engineer at the primary crystal site. One was a commander in the military hierarchy. One was a scientist who had access to the barrier control systems. The Devourer was being strategic, placing its agents where they could do the most damage. Elena went to see the infected soldier, Robert, who had been moved to an isolation chamber. He was awake now, and when he looked at Elena, there was confusion and fear in his eyes. "Something is wrong with me," he said weakly. "I can feel something in my body. It is not me anymore, but I am still here, watching, unable to control my own actions." Elena felt sympathy for him, but she also knew that there was no time for sentiment. "The crystal scientists are working on a way to remove the infiltrators without killing you. Until then, you will remain here, isolated." "If they succeed," Robert asked quietly, "what will happen to me?" Elena did not have an answer. The ancient builders had not left instructions for dealing with this specific situation. The infiltrators were not simple parasites. They were extensions of the Devourer itself, tiny pieces of a vast consciousness that could think and plan. Removing them might be possible, but it might also destroy the host body in the process. Over the next day, similar scenes played out across all the crystal sites. The infected individuals were found and isolated. The infiltrators began to panic, realizing that their presence was being detected. Several of them attempted to sabotage the crystal systems directly, and only quick action by guards and soldiers prevented complete network failures at 2 different sites. Elena realized that they were running out of time. The barrier would hold for a few more days at most, but the constant infiltration and sabotage would weaken it steadily. They needed a more decisive solution. She called a council meeting and presented a plan that made everyone in the room go silent. "We need to go on the offensive," she said. "We need to use the crystal network to track the Devourer's position and launch a direct counterattack. Not just defense, but an assault that will force the creature to either retreat completely or commit more of itself to this world, which would make it vulnerable to our weapons." Margaret looked troubled. "That would require taking power away from the barrier to fuel an attack. We would be weakening our defenses to launch an offensive." "Yes," Elena agreed. "But if we do not act now, the infiltrators will eventually break the barrier anyway. At least this way we control when and how the confrontation happens." Kai, the elf scientist, spoke up. "The ancient builders created this world as a sanctuary, but they also created it as a weapon. The crystal network can focus the planetary energy into a beam that can reach into space. It was designed to do exactly what Elena is suggesting. I have been studying the records, and I believe the system is ready to be used." Lyra stood up and looked directly at Elena. "If we do this, there is no guarantee that we will survive. We might lose everything." "We will definitely lose everything if we do nothing," Elena replied. "The Devourer does not tire. It does not give up. Its hunger is infinite, but it is also vulnerable to things it does not expect. It has never faced a unified world before. It has never faced a species that would be willing to risk everything to defend their home." Elena reached out through her bond with Ember and Storm. The dragons had been waiting outside the command center, sensing the importance of the decisions being made inside. Now they came forward, their massive forms filling the room with their presence. Ember moved to Elena's side, and the great dragon placed her head gently against the elf woman's back. Margaret looked at the dragons and at Elena, seeing the connection between them. She looked at Lyra and at the assembled humans and elves in the room. Then she nodded. "We will do it. We will prepare the weapon and launch the attack at first light. But Elena, you will pilot this attack. You are the only one who can." Elena accepted this responsibility without hesitation. She spent the rest of the day and night preparing the crystal network for its transformation from a defensive barrier into an offensive weapon. She accessed the deepest records left by the ancient builders, learning the secrets of how to focus planetary power into a coherent beam. By the time dawn broke, everything was ready. The barrier had been partially lowered in specific locations, drawing power away from defense and feeding it into the attack systems. Elena stood in the primary crystal chamber with her hands placed on the central crystal nexus. Behind her, Storm and Ember stood ready to lend their power and strength to her effort. Across the communication network, soldiers and civilians in New Haven had gathered to watch. They would see what came next on their screens and displays. The fate of their world depended on Elena's ability to channel power and intention through the crystal network into a weapon that had not been used for thousands of years. Elena closed her eyes and opened her mind to the network. Power flooded through her, enough to destroy a normal person instantly. But Elena was not normal. She was bonded to dragons. She carried the blood of the elves and the ingenuity of humans in her spirit. She was a bridge between worlds and species. The beam rose from the planet like a pillar of pure light, stretching up through the atmosphere and into space. The beam of energy struck the devourer with the force of 1,000 suns. The creature that had seemed so vast and unstoppable in its shadow form was suddenly revealed in its true nature. It was a collection of small organisms, each one individually tiny, but collectively enormous. The beam cut through them like a knife through water, destroying billions of infiltrators and smaller units in an instant. The devourer shrieked, a sound that echoed across the planet and made everyone who heard it feel as though their bones were vibrating. The creature began to move, pulling away from the planet, trying to escape the beam that was tearing through its form. But Elena maintained the power flow, drawing more and more energy from the crystal network, pushing the beam further and further into space. She could feel herself beginning to lose consciousness. The power flowing through her was too great for any single mind to bear. But Storm and Ember were there with her, their presence anchoring her to reality. They shared their strength with her, their ancient wisdom and connection to this world keeping her from being consumed by the energy she wielded. Then with a final pulse of light, the beam reached its maximum distance. It struck the core of the devourer, the central consciousness that controlled all the smaller organisms. For one breathtaking moment, everything went silent. The entire planet seemed to hold its breath. The devourer exploded into 1 billion fragments, its consciousness scattered across the vastness of space. The infiltrators that had been taken from the planet suddenly went inert, their connection to the central mind severed. The infected soldiers and workers slumped to the ground, freed from the presence that had been slowly consuming them. Elena collapsed, her consciousness fading as the power that had been flowing through her ceased. Storm caught her before she fell, cradling the elf woman on the dragon's back as gently as possible. Ember made a sound that was like weeping, and Elena heard the deep sorrow in that sound before the darkness took her completely. When Elena woke 3 days later, she found herself in a medical center in New Haven surrounded by doctors and scientists. Her body was covered in places where the intense power had burned through her skin and damaged her flesh. But the burns were already healing, and the elf doctors assured her that there would be no permanent damage. Her connection to the dragons, they explained, had given her a resilience that normal people did not possess. Margaret was there when Elena finally woke fully. The human leader took Elena's hand gently. "You did it," Margaret said simply. "You destroyed it. The devourer is dead." But Elena could see the exhaustion in Margaret's eyes, and she understood that the cost had been high. "How many did we lose?" she asked. 17 soldiers in direct combat against the infiltrators, 8 infected people who did not survive the process of removing the parasites, and many more wounded and traumatized. But compared to what could have happened, we were fortunate. Elena nodded slowly. It was a terrible cost, but she understood that it was the price of survival. The ancient builders had known that peace would not come without sacrifice. They had prepared this world for conflict, but they had also prepared it with the tools to survive. Over the following weeks, Elena worked with the scientists and engineers to understand what had happened to the devourer. The machine in the Forbidden Zone confirmed her suspicions. The creature was not truly dead, but it was severely damaged. The fragments of its consciousness had been dispersed so widely across space that they would take decades or centuries to regroup and become a threat again. Perhaps by that time, the people of New Haven would have developed even better defenses. But Elena also learned something else from the machine. The ancient builders had created more than one sanctuary world. There were hundreds of them scattered across the galaxy, each one populated with intelligent species who had been given the tools and knowledge to defend themselves. The devourer had visited some of these worlds and left them empty and barren. Others had successfully repelled the creature, just as Elena and her people had done. "You are part of something larger than yourself," the machine told her through the crystal network. "Across the galaxy, your kind and others are learning to stand together against the darkness. Each world that successfully defends itself adds to the collective strength of all the sanctuary worlds. Eventually, the devourer will be stopped permanently, Not by a single world, but by the unified will of all the free peoples of the galaxy. Elena shared this knowledge with Margaret and Lyra, and they in turn shared it with the Council and the people of New Haven. The realization that they were not alone, that others like them were fighting the same battle, seemed to lift a weight from everyone's shoulders. They had won their victory not in isolation, but as part of a larger community of resistance. 3 months after the final battle, Elena stood on the highest point of New Haven with Storm and Ember beside her. The protective barrier still glowed around the colony, but it was no longer the desperate defense of a people under siege. It had become something else, a beacon of hope and a symbol of unity. Humans and elves moved through the streets of the colony together now, working side by side in shops and schools and research centers. Children of both species played together in the parks. Gardens had been planted that combined human agricultural knowledge with elf understanding of nature. Musicians performed concerts that blended human instruments with elf melodies. The two species were not perfectly integrated yet, but the process had begun, and it could not be reversed. David approached Elena and the dragons with a smile on his face. "The scientists want to know if you will work with us on a new project," he said. "We want to establish communication with the other sanctuary worlds. We want to share technology and knowledge and perhaps even send an expedition beyond our world." Elena looked out across the planet, at the network of crystals that glowed with gentle light beneath the earth. She thought about the ancient builders and their grand vision of creating worlds where intelligent species could develop and eventually reach for the stars themselves. "Tell them yes," Elena said. "Tell them that the people of this world are ready to become part of something greater." Lyra appeared beside Elena, the ancient elf woman moving quietly, as elves always did. "You have given us more than survival," Lyra said. "You have given us purpose." The elves were beginning to fade, to lose meaning in this world. Now we have a role to play, a future to build. Elena turned to the old elf and saw tears in her eyes. "We all found our role when we learned to work together," Elena said gently. Storm and Ember made soft sounds, and Elena reached out to touch both of them. Through their bond, she felt their contentment and their hope for the future. The dragons had been isolated for so long, the last of their kind. Now they were part of a community again, valued and needed and loved. That night, Elena sat alone in the crystal chamber and communed with the machine one final time. "What happens now?" she asked. "What is my purpose going forward?" The machine's voice seemed almost warm when it responded. "You are the bridge between worlds, between species, between the old knowledge and the new future. You will be needed in the years to come as your people learn to reach beyond your world. But tonight, you should rest. Tonight, you should celebrate with your people what you have accomplished together. The work of building the future can wait until morning." Elena smiled and left the crystal chamber. She emerged into the cool night air to find that a celebration was already underway in the colony. Humans and elves danced together under the light of the twin moons. Music filled the air. Laughter echoed through the streets. Storm and Ember had been given a special place of honor at the center of the gathering, and people approached them carefully and respectfully, touching their scales and speaking words of gratitude. Elena joined the celebration, dancing with Margaret and with Lyra, speaking with old friends and new acquaintances from both species. She thought about how far they had come in such a short time, from suspicion and fear to unity and cooperation. As the night grew late and the celebration began to wind down, Elena found herself standing once again at the highest point of the colony. Storm rested his head on her shoulder, and Ember curled up beside her, her great body creating a protective shelter from the cool night wind. The barrier glowed softly around them, and beyond it, the stars shone brightly in the darkness of space. Somewhere out there, other worlds were fighting their own battles. Somewhere out there, other species were learning to work together to survive and to thrive. And here, on this sanctuary world, Elena and her people had taken the first steps toward a future that would be filled with endless possibility. The ancient builders had prepared this world well, but they could not have predicted exactly what would happen when humans, elves, and dragons were brought together. That outcome had been written not by the ancient ones, but by the choices that Elena and her people had made. And in making those choices, they had begun something that would change the galaxy forever.